Hello everyone, I am Dr. Allàn Laville, and this is an introduction in regards to my entry into psychology and also into diversity and inclusion. So I have a few different roles at the moment. So I'm predominantly based at the University of Reading, and I have a split role. So I'm the Dean for Diversity and Inclusion for 3 days a week, and then a lecturer in clinical psychology for 2 days a week. I said predominantly at Reading because also I have other roles outside of the university as well, with the main one being a member and strategic lead for the Presidential Taskforce for Diversity and Inclusion that is owned by the British Psychological Society. So as part of this introduction, I've been asked to talk about the various different steps that I've taken in my career so far. So I thought if I go back more or less to the beginning, so looking in terms of deciding to take psychology as an A-level, and then I found that I really enjoyed that and I did well enough to get into a university course. So I did my undergraduate at the University of Surrey. And what was really useful about that, and I'd strongly suggest programs like this to others or relevant work experience, is there was a placement year in the third year. So for my placement year, I worked in an acute inpatient ward for adults with severe and enduring mental health difficulties. And that really opened my eyes to the different experiences that people have, and also the particular needs and support that people require. And that is crucial in terms of graduate opportunities. So I remember when I was doing my undergraduate, some people saying, oh, well, I'm just going to do the straight BSc. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you do a straight BSc without a placement year, then it'd be looking at placement or voluntary experience, such as a healthcare assistant or volunteering for Samaritans, or shadowing people within improving access to psychological therapies, service, with a view of maybe working there on a voluntary basis after graduation. Related to this, I would say, would be the first challenge that any psychology graduate faces, is that it's incredibly competitive, and there I think are two different routes that I would follow. So either the first route that I was talking about would be looking at gaining more relevant experience. If you're thinking of going for assistant psychologist posts or as a trainee psychological wellbeing practitioner in IAPT, so that's improving access to psychological therapies, the number of applications could be up to about 100 for every one place. It might be far fewer than that, but I know when I went for my post as a trainee PWP in IAPT in southwest London, there was about 100 applications for each post. The other part to consider is looking at postgraduate study. So I did an MSc straight after my BSc, and it was clinically related. It was at the University of Reading, and it was in developmental psychopathology. And that was really useful to specialise in a particular area, and then also to further support my ideas at the time of going into a clinical career. So further study and or relevant experience as well. After my MSc, I was doing the PWP training. I went back and did that at the University of Surrey, and that was excellent to get insight into individuals experiencing common mental health conditions, and also into cognitive behavioural therapy and how to deliver evidence-based interventions in cognitive behavioural therapy. I really enjoyed that, but I also missed the research component within psychology. So a year or two later, I went back to studies at the University of Reading and started, and then 6 years later, I did it part-time, completed my PhD, and that was in cognitive developmental psychology, specifically looking at how children distinguish between fancy and reality, and what processes such as emotion or context or knowledge influence a child's ability to separate fancy from reality. So quite different from my clinical work. because it was predominantly looking at decision making and thought processes, but we also, excuse me, we also looked at children with ASD and their fantasy reality judgments as well. So alongside my PhD, and going back to the clinical part, I was then a tutor on the PW programme at Reading, which I did for a few years. I was then promoted to a senior tutor, and then a few years after that, promoted to programme director. And I've held the programme director role for the MSci in applied psychology, almost forgot that, applied psychology clinical, since 2016. So that's a really exciting role to lead on the strategy of an evidence-based psychological programme. And within that is 4 years. The first 2 years are the same as the BSc, then the students do their PW training in the 3rd year, and then in the 4th year they do their MSc study. So in 4 years they've covered an awful lot of material. So more recently, over the last few years, my role changed to a more broader clinical psychology role. So I hold a lecture in clinical psychology post now, which also includes other parts such as project supervision, academic/personal tutees, and also PhD students. But I really, and I guess this is one of the main reasons why I'm talking here today, is developed my interest in diversity inclusion. So since 2011, I've developed and delivered training on working with sexual diversity and sexual diversity considerations within therapeutic settings. Beyond that, I then specialised in bi-identities and took part on Stonewall's bi role model training back in 2017. And in 2018-19, I was the co-chair of our LGBT+ staff network. For me, I think lived experience should be the driver into best practice, and best practice ultimately leads to various different accreditations like the Stonewall Workplace Equality Index. More recently, I've also explored student experience, so both the student experience of LGBT+ students and also students with disabilities. We use that term very broadly, also to incorporate and include, and in some ways separate, neurodiversity. So considering specific learning difficulties or differences, looking at ADHD and also ASD. And we're really interested in, not that everyone sees mental health as a disability, but it'd be classed in terms of impairment under the Quality Act as a disability, looking at students' experiences with mental health conditions in higher education. All of that contributes, of course, to my role as Dean for Diversity and Inclusion. So I oversee our work for LGBT+, our work for disability and neurodiversity, our work for race, and our work for gender, and of course work across all the 9 protected characteristics under the Quality Act, but those are our 4 priority areas. So also considering other challenges as well. So I identify as bi myself. I've never necessarily seen my sexual identity as a barrier. I know it's not the same for everyone, but what I have considered quite a lot is representation. And I think representation of sexual minorities, particularly in leadership roles, has developed in recent years. But there's still more work to be done across higher education in terms of representation of LGBT+ individuals. Some people might say, well, what does your sexuality have to do with work? Well, actually, it's far more than that. We need to consider bringing your true, authentic self to work and feeling comfortable and safe to be able to do that. And that's really where any characteristic of any person features within the workplace. We know that individuals are more effective, feel more valued and supported by workplaces that recognise and value diversity and inclusion, including personal characteristics. The other areas where there have been more considerations for me are in terms of my neurodiversity and also mental health conditions I experience. So I often give, and we don't really have time today, but separate talks around, or even in my teaching in the classroom, around perfectionism and how that's related to anxiety and low mood. Also in relation to my neurodiversity and the structure and rules and approaches that support me in a particular way to work, but also at the same time being flexible, but not having that complete flexible abstract approach to work that is really useful for some people, but for me I need some type of structure and rough guidance in terms of where do we see this piece of work going. And indeed it can be quite brief, but just the crack on and get on with it approach doesn't really work very well. So one example of that is when we look at, when we're at university and we're looking at marking rubrics. So I feel very passionate, and it's been part of my work as well, that students should have clear marking rubrics. And what I mean by that is really clear criteria. So you need to know what you're being assessed on. You need to know, in my opinion, the weighting for each of those areas. So if you're being assessed on relevance material, how much is that weighted? Critical analysis, how much is that weighted? Style, how much is that weighted? And you need to be aware of that when you're planning your piece of work. And that's really important, that that guidance is offered. For us, for example, we embed it within the classroom teaching. We then have discussion boards where students can discuss criteria and approaches. And then we also have recorded screencasts, which we've been doing for the last couple of years before COVID-19. And this guides students through the assessment rubrics, and then they can visit as many times as they need to. And they can also ask questions through the discussion boards as well. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of structure and guidance. Not necessarily rigidity, but some structure and guidance. So that's a challenge that I've faced, and those programs I've done when there is really clear criteria are typically ones that I've done better at. And I think there is a role and responsibility of a program to make sure that that guidance is delivered. So the last part that I've been asked to discuss is how or why is diversity and inclusion important to your line of work? So one way to explore this, I think, would then be look at my BPS role. So my BPS role as strategic lead, we're really looking at embedding and how and why diversity and inclusion is embedded within training, both initial accredited training and also CPD training as well. So continuing professional development training that people do once they've qualified in a particular discipline or area. And that's really important because we need to make sure that we have a good coverage of diversity and inclusion, particularly, well, of course, across all psychology programs, but particularly in practitioner programs when people will be working with members of the public, and they need to have a really good working knowledge and then applying theory to practice in regards to signposting people to relevant services in relation to diversity and inclusion. So it's an absolute must that it features there. And of course, for qualified practitioners to continually update their knowledge through the CPD or diversity inclusion focus. Of course, that's not the only part of the picture. So the Taskforce is also looking at increasing representation of underrepresented groups within psychology. We know, particularly within clinical psychology, that ethnic minorities are massively underrepresented. And also when you speak to many different individuals, they feel that clinical psychology, there's a particular gender and class of people that are overrepresented within clinical psychology as well. Of course, that's a very broad brushstroke, but it is something that has been identified. People are commenting on, and rightly so, and is something that is looking to be addressed. And I know indeed there is an action plan to address just that. So that's sort of a context statement really around my role and diversity and inclusion, why it's important. But essentially, diversity and inclusion is throughout all my work. So throughout my clinical psychology work, throughout my student experience work, of course in my BPS work, and within my dean work as well. And ultimately, why is it important? Well, going back to what I said earlier about everyone being able to be their authentic and true self. And some people say, well, wouldn't it be great if we didn't even have to think about diversity and inclusion? And ultimately, yes, if everyone, there was equality, equity, and acknowledgement of the creativity and values of the different attitudes and experience of diverse people and diverse groups, then absolutely that would be spot on. But we're not there yet. How do we know we're not there yet? Well, when we look at the International Day for Elimination of Racial Discrimination, well, we know that when we look at the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia and Transphobia, when we look at International Women's Day, when we look at Disability History Month, all of those are sending a very clear message that we need to raise awareness. We need to all be very clear and educate ourselves on different experiences that different people and different groups may have. We also need to be very clear on prejudice and discrimination. And there's a lot of psychological theories around prejudice and discrimination, and then the impact that has on individuals from a minority group. So we're certainly not there yet, and that's absolutely what we're striving for. But in my opinion, it's far too early, even though some people have said this to me, that, oh, well, everything's fine now. Well, it may be fine for some people in some circumstances, but our journey for diversity and inclusion is far from over, in my opinion, which might be too blunt and harsh, but I'm always very honest and say what I truly believe. So I think that's long enough from me in terms of my introduction, and I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion. So thank you very much and take care.